Pretty dramatic. That's a clip from CCTV America's latest documentary on thin ice. It shows that the Arctic is warming twice as fast as any other place on the planet. It's melting sea ice and bringing powerful storms that foster coastal erosion. In short, climate change is having a dramatic effect on the people who have carved out a way of life in the harsh region. It's also threatening one of their most cherished practices, whaling. All this week, we'll bring you stories from the Arctic. We begin with Callebs in Barrow, Alaska.
Far above the Arctic Circle each spring, these huge mammals migrate past the northernmost town in the United States, Barrow, Alaska.
We got 7 buckets, 7 tables.
And native Alaskans here count on the annual whale harvest to survive.
The beauty of the whale is what we see out here, what was created by God, and we respect him and honor him and give him thanks once we are blessed with a whale.
It is difficult to explain just how important Arctic wildlife is to native Alaskans living in this part of the world. They depend on the animals for food and clothing. This is the jawbone of a bowhead whale, an animal virtually sacred to native Alaskans living along the coastline. Each year, the men head out in sealskin boats to go after bowhead whales, and that animal can be massive. I mean massive. These two bones represent the jaw of one bowhead whale that can reach 60 tons.
There are only a handful of whaling captains like Ned Array in each town. A position of prestige and power in native villages. Array took us some 15 kilometers out on the jagged sea ice to understand what goes into whaling and how this world is being affected by climate change.
The people that hunt out in this ocean was passed on from tradition to tradition from our forefathers, and we have been taught to respect the ocean, the land, the sea, and hunt what we harvest to feed the community.
This is how teenagers in the community work their way onto a whaling boat. Back-breaking work called breaking trail, clearing a path to open water so Array and others can bring their sleds, tents, boats, everything they need to hunt. But life is changing here.
Over the years, it has kind of changed to the ice being a little bit thinner over the course of time.
In the last 30 years, almost half of the polar ice has melted. Thinning ice is a big problem because whaling crews need thick ice to drag the whale onto once it's been harpooned.
It's spiritually and culturally, nutritionally an extremely important animal, and has been for various estimates go back 1,000, 2,000 years.
Craig George has been researching whales in Barrow for more than 40 years. He's used to seeing people line up in Barrow to receive their cut of whale once one is harvested. But George says it's not just melting sea ice that threatens whaling and this way of life. Oil and gas exploration and the potential risks it brings could be coming here now that ice is melting. And ships are now going where they never could before.
Yeah, it's a concern. Oil spills are probably the biggest threat from offshore oil and gas, although ship collisions are a possibility.
It's been beneficial to see and observe and sighting whales already and harvesting seals and providing for our immediate family and loved ones in home that are craving for some of this native food.
It's a harsh lifestyle made more difficult by climate change. But right now, no one here is ready to surrender culture and heritage, no matter how much the elements alter their native environment.
An incredible story from CCTV's Callebs in Barrow, Alaska. Sean spent a lot of time there in the Arctic. He's now back here in Washington. Sean, what a different way of life there in the Arctic, huh?
Yeah, it really is. Everything from the way that their culture, heritage goes back thousands of years. People have been able to live in that incredibly cold environment, incredibly harsh, unforgiving environment, and getting to spend some time with a whaling captain who really explains how important a subsistence way of life is to the people who live in that region and how this is something that is being threatened by not huge dramatic changes in the climate, but just these subtle uptick in temperature. It doesn't take a whole lot, but it is certainly changing the way of life up there. And also, when you spend time with a lot of the indigenous population, their ancestors have literally spent thousands of years walking the ice. They were the first people to really recognize that the ice was getting thinner up above the Arctic Circle. And a lot of scientists at first, Mike, 20, 30 years ago, didn't believe it. But now everyone is buying into it.
Yeah, well, I'm telling you, you're talking about that threat. It's one thing for Arctic nations to be interested in what's going on at the top of the planet, but does that extend to the rest of the world?
Yeah, it really does. There are 8 nations that have land above the Arctic Circle, but really the entire Arctic is a global area. It's one region of the world that throughout history, nations have been able to put any kind of differences aside, any kind of geopolitical disputes, and focus on that area. It is very important to the rest of the world. There's something called the Arctic Council, where they meet and they talk about changes that could be affecting that area. But really, every nation does. The United States, China. China has a polar exploration, a research station up in the Arctic right now. And what this goes back to is the way that nations are trying to cut their use of fossil fuels to cut down the emissions of greenhouse gases. And let's put that into perspective, why it is so important right now. China is really one of the nations, if not the nation, leading the world in trying to find alternative forms of energy. Coal use in China has gone down. Wind turbines, 1 out of every 3 in the world, are now in China. They get about 8% of their energy from wind and about 21% from hydro. So really, as nations begin to pare back, the people of the North are really watching what's going to happen because they have so much at stake in all of this.
We're beginning this series, of course, at the same time as the climate talks begin in Paris. It really does put a human face on these issues. How important is that, and how closely are the people there in the Arctic watching what's happening in Paris?
It's a good question, and people have been watching very closely what's going on in Paris and very closely listening to what nations are saying about their efforts to stem the rise of global climate change. There's so much at stake in all of this because as sea ice melts, as sea ice begins to give way in the coastal areas, and as the snow and ice begins to remove itself from this permafrost, these long frozen areas, a lot of countries have an eye on what's going on up there. A very, very small fraction of the population of the world lives above the Arctic Circle. There are about 4 million. 2 million of those are in Russia, but as much as 30% of the natural resources left in the world are above that area. So as it begins to thaw and melt away, people come up looking for chemicals, looking for minerals, and there's a lot of research going on as well. United States, China have so much at stake up in that area, monitoring, trying to keep a good close look on exactly what is going on in the atmosphere, what's going on to the environment, and really the people who live in that area kind of outsiders looking at their world, knowing that what they're doing really isn't affecting climate change to a great degree, but climate change is being affected by what's going on outside that area.